Between 1882 and 1892, New York City perfected two machines at the same time. One said it was saving children, the other made money by turning human difference into spectacle. They operated in the same streets, in the same decade, feeding on the same kind of vulnerability. And when you place them side by side, the silence in the record stops feeling accidental. Before we go further, subscribe, leave a comment with where you are watching from, and stay with me to the end. Because this is not just a forgotten chapter of American history. It is a story about children whose names were erased so thoroughly that millions of descendants are still living inside the gap. The version of this history most people know is the gentler version. It begins with crowded tenements, freezing streets, hungry children, and reformers who looked at New York's swelling population of poor miners and decided something drastic had to be done. In 1853, Charles Loring Brace founded the Children's Aid Society. In 1854, the first group of children was sent west. Over the next 75 years, an estimated 250,000 children were transported out of eastern cities and into rural homes across the Midwest and beyond. They were placed on trains, sent to towns that had agreed to receive them, lined up before local adults, and chosen. That much is established. That much is in the official histories. And to be fair, not every ending was cruel. Some children did find stable homes. Some found affection, opportunity, and a life that would have been impossible in the worst districts of New York. Historians and museums that preserve orphan train history are right to insist on that. The movement was not a single story with a single outcome. There were children who later spoke with gratitude. There were children who built families, farms, businesses, and political careers. But the success stories have always done something else as well. They have softened the public memory of a system that was never built to preserve identity with care. The phrase orphan train itself is misleading. Many of the children were not orphans in the strict sense at all. Some had lost one parent, not both. Some had a mother still living somewhere in the city. Some came from families so poor that surrendering a child was treated as an act of survival rather than abandonment. In some cases, only certain siblings were given up, while others stayed behind. Even the National Orphan Train Complex explains that family poverty, illness, death, and overcrowding all fed the system, and that siblings were often separated before or during placement. The word orphan made the public feel cleaner than the truth did. The Children's Aid Society called the process placing out. That phrase also deserves scrutiny. It sounds administrative, even humane, but the underlying logic was relentlessly physical. Boys were praised as sturdy, useful, energetic, suitable for farm labor. Girls were praised for domestic promise, obedience, and their ability to work inside a household. At many stops, townspeople examined children face to face, judged their health, their age, their temperament, their bodies, and then chose. Some children were welcomed. Some were rejected in public. Some were taken in as sons and daughters. Others were acquired as unpaid labor dressed in the language of rescue. The paperwork that should have protected them was inconsistent from the start. Records existed, but not in any centralized way. Different agencies kept different files. Some intake information was sparse. Some children arrived with little more than a first name, an estimated age, and a note about appearance or religion. Birth dates could be guessed. Names could be changed. A child could be renamed at intake, renamed again after placement, and then folded into a household whose version of the past became the only surviving version. If siblings were split, those new names could branch into entirely separate lines. Descendants trying to reconstruct a family tree still run into that wall today. Now hold that reality in your mind and shift only a few blocks south and east across Manhattan. In the same broad era, another industry flourished on the commercial display of human bodies. Cheap museums, curiosity halls, storefront attractions, variety stages, and later circus sideshows all competed for public attention. New York was one of the great capitals of this world. The Bowery became a dense zone of visual entertainment, photography studios, theaters, saloons, cheap attractions, and human exhibition. This was not a minor sideshow to respectable society. It was an industry with real money in it. A child or young adult whose body could be framed as rare, exceptional, or astonishing might become a featured act. Promoters understood this perfectly. Ella Ewing, later famous as the Missouri Giantess, was approached because an agent heard rumors about her body and recognized profit before he recognized personhood. Her father hesitated, and the hesitation matters. It tells you that even in poverty, family advocacy could create a barrier between a child and the market. It could negotiate terms. It could refuse. It could demand pay. It could preserve a real name. Charles Eisenman's studio in the Bowery photographed many of the most famous and many of the least documented sideshow performers of the late 19th century. Syracuse University's collection of his work shows just how extensive that image economy became. Cabinet cards and cartes de visite turned unusual bodies into collectibles. A performer's portrait could circulate far beyond the stage itself. The image survived. The biography often did not. Some performers became famous under stage names so dominant that their actual origins faded almost completely behind the promotional fiction. Historians of the sideshow world have long pointed out that promoters routinely exaggerated, fictionalized, or wholly invented backstories. That was part of the business model. The body was real. The narrative wrapped around it was often commercial theater. On one side, institutions in New York were processing poor, abandoned, surrendered, and displaced children at scale. They were washing them, classifying them, renaming them, moving them, separating siblings, and sending them into a national distribution network whose records were anything but complete. On the other side, an entertainment economy centered in the same city was hungry for bodies that could be sold as marvels, anomalies, prodigies, and curiosities. It paid well when the body was marketable enough. It accepted stage names, false biographies, and radical gaps in documentation as ordinary practice. It did not require a clean paper trail. In some cases, the absence of one was an advantage. That overlap does not prove transfer. It does something more unsettling. It establishes opportunity. This is the point where responsible history has to slow down, because the strongest statement is not the loudest one. No surviving ledger has yet surfaced with a line that says a child left an orphanage and was sold or transferred directly into a dime museum or sideshow circuit. No official placement book openly confesses that children considered unsuitable for farm labor or domestic service were diverted into exhibition. No whistleblower statement ties the systems together in one neat sentence. That document may not exist. It may have been destroyed. It may never have been written down. And history cannot honestly claim possession of proof it does not have. The years in which orphan train traffic surged were also years in which dime museums, commercial curiosities, and sideshow culture were thriving. The places mattered. The timing mattered. The children at risk mattered. The documentation gaps mattered. These are not romantic associations imposed from a distance. They are structural facts. Children were handled as units in a system built to relocate them, not to maintain a permanent, accessible account of who they had been. At the same time, performers could be absorbed into an entertainment economy that often replaced birth identity with stage identity so completely that later researchers are left with little more than photographs and promotional copy. Look closely at the language both systems used and the resemblance gets harder to ignore. Orphan agencies described usefulness, health, obedience, work capacity, adaptability. Showmen described rarity, astonishment, novelty, drawing power. Different goals. Yes. But the same underlying habit of evaluating children through the visible utility of their bodies. A sturdy boy could be sold to the Midwest as future labor. A girl considered disciplined and healthy could be placed as domestic help. But what happened to the children whose bodies did not fit those ordinary categories? What happened to children whose growth was unusual, whose appearance was marked, whose limbs, faces, posture, or proportions placed them outside what receiving families wanted? In a humane and closely monitored system, we would expect a clear answer. In this system, the answer is haze. But when the records are fragmented, when names shift, when siblings disappear into separate state lines, when institutions themselves admit that many files are incomplete or inaccessible, uncertainty stops being exculpatory. It becomes part of the indictment. Listen to the emotional testimony that survived from orphan train riders late in life, and you hear the cost beneath the public mythology. Success and damage coexisted in the same movement. The problem is that the archival structure preserves the triumphal stories far better than it preserves the disappearances. An Eisenman portrait can be haunting because it preserves the gaze while withholding the life. A child or young performer stands before the camera under a marketable identity. The costume is fixed. The pose is fixed. The body is the event. But before the cabinet card, who was that person? Who named them? Who signed for them? Who knew where they slept at age 7, or 9, or 12? Who would have noticed if they vanished from an institution ledger and reappeared under a stage name 2 neighborhoods away? In too many cases, nobody left an answer that survives. That is the nightmare possibility hidden inside otherwise respectable archives. Not that every institution was secretly funneling children into spectacle, but that a city capable of losing children administratively was also a city capable of absorbing them commercially, and the broader American culture of the period made that absorption thinkable. This was an era that accepted public inspection of children in train stations, an era that accepted poor children being judged for labor potential, an era that accepted the display of physically unusual people as mass entertainment, an era that often treated poverty as moral failure and bodily difference as public property. Once you understand that moral landscape, the gap between placement and display no longer feels impossible. It feels horrifyingly compatible with the logic of the age. I sat with that question because the temptation in a story like this is to overstate. But restraint does not remove the weight of what remains. What can be said, carefully and clearly, is enough to disturb any honest reader. The orphan train movement moved enormous numbers of children through systems with weak standardization and broken continuity of identity. The New York Foundling and other placing out agencies handled children in ways that later made family reconstruction difficult or impossible. The dime museum and sideshow world of New York monetized unusual bodies and tolerated fabricated biographies as routine. Charles Eisenman's Bowery photographs stand as visual evidence of how many performers entered public view without durable, verifiable origin stories attached to them, and both worlds drew from populations with the least power to refuse. That is why the locked archives matter so much, not because every sealed file contains a sensational crime, but because every sealed file preserves the possibility that the institution's public memory is incomplete in ways that protect the institution more than the child. When descendants ask for names, origins, or copies, and receive only non-identifying summaries or dead ends, they are not just encountering bureaucracy, they are encountering the afterlife of a system that often treated children as movable matter first and human continuity second. The most chilling sentence in this entire history may be the simplest one. The system was not built to remember. It was built to process. Once you see that, the trains and the museum stop looking like separate stories. They become neighboring expressions of the same 19th century instinct. Take the vulnerable, reclassify them, give them a new role, attach a new name, extract value. Then let the paperwork thin out until the original self becomes difficult to retrieve. In one version, the value extracted was farm labor or domestic labor wrapped in benevolence. In the other, the value extracted was spectacle wrapped in entertainment. Either way, the child's prior identity could become inconvenient, and that is why this is not dead history. Millions of Americans are living with the consequences now. Some know an orphan train rider appears somewhere in the family tree but cannot get past a renamed child in an intake book. Some know an ancestor appeared on the show circuit under an invented title but cannot recover the family before the stage. Some stare at an old portrait and recognize the face without being able to restore the name. They inherit not only bloodlines, but institutional silences. So no, I cannot tell you with certainty that orphanages in New York fed children directly into the sideshow economy. History has not yet produced the document that would let anyone say that without qualification. But I can tell you something that should be enough to demand better research than we have. The conditions were there. The overlap was there. The motive was there. The vulnerable population was there. The geography was there. The appetite was there. The record gaps were there. And the children who vanished into those gaps were real. They had first names before they had stage names. They had siblings before they had audience labels. They had mothers, fathers, churches, tenement rooms, languages, nicknames, and ordinary lives before institutions and promoters converted them into manageable categories. Some of them reached loving homes and carried their real selves forward. Some did not. Some entered a corridor of paperwork so thin and so fractured that later generations can only see the outline where a life should be. Until those archives are opened more fully, until intake records are matched against placements with real rigor, Until sealed files are treated as historical obligations rather than institutional property, we are still relying on systems that lost children to certify that nothing unthinkable happened. That is not good enough. Not for 250,000 children. Not for the descendants trying to recover a severed line. And not for the unnamed boys and girls who passed through Lower Manhattan, the Upper East Side, the Bowery, and the train depots as if the city were sorting them for uses the records were never meant to reveal. If this history unsettles you, it should. Because the most dangerous thing about a processing system is not only what it does in public, it is what it can conceal in the administrative dark. The orphan trains have been remembered as mercy. The dime museums have been remembered as cruelty and curiosity. But memory is too neat. Real history is messier. Real history is a city where rescue and exploitation can share a border, where institutions can call themselves guardians while keeping incomplete ledgers, and where children can disappear, not in one dramatic moment, but in a sequence of ordinary procedural acts that erase them one line at a time. Somewhere in those files are children who were described, counted, washed, renamed, and moved. Somewhere in those photographs are faces presented as novelties after the rest of the self had been stripped away. The records we have are enough to praise some outcomes. They are also enough to expose a terrifying possibility the archives still refuse to settle. And until that silence is broken, the question remains exactly where history left it, in the narrow space between the orphanage and the Bowery, where a child could be processed out of one system and vanish into another.